Hello, top notchers. How are you doing? I hope you are doing great and amazing, guys. Welcome to my channel one more time, and welcome to the reading program. We have a new book of the day, All the President's Men, for Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. They are both journalists, and they are talking about the biggest scandal in the United States. The history of the United States. Okay, it's called the Watergate Scandal. All right, we're gonna know all about it. We're gonna know what the president did. Okay, just to hide these scandals, and what Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward discovered. Okay, through the investigation of the Watergate Scandal. Okay, so let's read and listen at the book at the same time. All right, because this is a very good way for learning, okay, and for acquiring new information. This is like a story, all right, in the book, and describe exactly what happened, all right, with President Nixon, and what the journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, what would happen to them. Okay, so let's get started, okay, and let's listen to this book.
The Watergate scandal remains one of the biggest scandals in the history of the United States and the world at large. The conspiracy, which saw a lot of strong personalities around the president resign, also saw a U.S. president resign after being threatened with impeachment. When 5 burglars were caught at the Democratic Party headquarters in 1972, nobody had any idea it was going to cause a significant shakedown and the resignation of a president. Through their own words, the lead journalists and investigators have told the story of how it was in such a way that almost all the details were present. In what is regarded as the most intelligent investigation by many people, Woodward and Bernstein have been able to pull a masterclass to write a masterpiece. No matter what you want to know about one of the biggest scandals in U.S. politics, this book is a must-read for you. The unraveling of one of the biggest scandals in the world started with a simple phone call. On the 19th of June, 1972, Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward received a call around 9 a.m. He was told that 5 men had broken into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate office, apartment hotel complex. Fellow journalist Carl Bernstein later joined Woodward in the story. The 2 journalists were tasked with finding out the real story behind the burglary because some things did not add up. The burglars seemed unfazed when caught, and they already had a lawyer in place for themselves. After several names and numerous attempts to gain information from inside sources, Woodward and Bernstein established that Howard Hunt, the consultant to the White House, was the lead suspect. Through this connection, they were able to discover that the burglars were there to bug the headquarters with wiretapping devices. In what should have been an open and shut case, the burglars' preparedness and demeanor showed that there was more to it than meets the eye. President Nixon created a campaign team for his re-election named the Committee for the Re-election of the President (CRP). Woodward started investigating a Hunt-Colson connection, leading to the knowledge about Hunt's involvement. Charles Colson was the special counsel to the president. Nixon publicly denied any involvement of his staff in the conspiracy. Hunt disappeared after he received a call from Woodward. Woodward pressed further by contacting Newsweek to get the story about how Gordon Liddy, the finance counsel, was fired for not answering questions about Watergate. These connections confirmed that the burglary was not just any open and shut case. There was more to it than meets the eye. Woodward and Bernstein worked separately but would come back together to share information learned. Bernstein met with Hunt in Miami and got information on some $89,000 in checks deposited into Barker's, one of the burglars', bank accounts, plus an additional $25,000 check. $89,000 was from a Mexican lawyer, and $25,000 from Kenneth H. Dahlberg. Dahlberg was the Midwest campaign head, and he said that the money was raised for the Nixon campaign. Dahlberg, on the other hand, said he had given the money to Maurice Stans and Hugh Sloan, who were the finance chairman CRP and treasurer CRP respectively. Woodward was relentless in his quest for genuine and high-quality information. Woodward pressed for more information, but most of his contacts tried to deny any involvement in the allegations. Woodward confirmed that Dahlberg had given the checks to Stans, even though there was no report of this from Stans to the Federal Elections Division of General Accounting Office (GAO). This prompted a quick investigation by GAO. Upon this investigation, Sloan resigned as CRP treasurer. Gao then discovered a big slush fund in the tune of $100,000, overseen by Gordon Liddy, the finance counsel CRP. Stans told Gao that the Mexican money came all the way from Texas. Bernstein traced this lead and tried to track down the Texas Committee chairman Robert Allen for adequate information. President Nixon came.
Right, so Bernstein discovered that several key members of the White House knew about or were party to the Watergate scandal. All right, that's what he found. What he found out. So let's see what President Nixon did.
Out to deny all the allegations, saying that none of his White House members knew about the scandal. Woodward and Bernstein started to interview CRP members to get more information and unravel the mystery of the Watergate scandal. The two journalists found out that the FBI did not interview a lot of key people who knew about the fact that the Democratic Party headquarters was bugged. Woodward established a connection with an inside source right in the executive branch. The inside source identified himself as Deep Throat. Deep Throat promised to give exclusive information to Woodward and Bernstein if they agree never to quote him or try to find out his identity. Woodward and Deep Throat initially communicated via telephone, but as the Watergate tension increased, Deep Throat grew nervous and suggested physical meetings instead. They both agreed on a signal, and they met on several occasions. Deep Throat's
affirmation that Howard Hunt was involved in the case showed that the White House had someone or some people who leaked confidential information to Washington Post. Okay.
Information led Woodward and Bernstein to Gordon Liddy, whom this time confirmed that Deputy Campaign Director Stuart Magruder, Deputy Director CRP Frederick LaRue, and Campaign Director CRP Clark McGregor were heavily involved in the Watergate scandal. Washington Post's news calling out members of the CRP caused a major shakedown between members of the Nixon cabinet. Former Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, was starting to come in the scandal too. Mitchell had resigned as Nixon's campaign manager, but he remained in the capacity as a critical member of the CRP. Reporters met with Sloan and found out that 5 critical members of CRP had authorization over a huge fund that was suspected of having been used to pay the burglars. The 5 were Mitchell, Stans, Magruder, a White House staff suspected to be H.R. Haldeman, the assistant to the president. The last suspect, Bernstein guessed, was Nixon's personal attorney, Herbert Kalmbach. The Washington Post published news calling out these members, and this caused a shakedown. The possibility of President Nixon's involvement in the scandal was starting to materialize. On 28 September 1972, Bernstein received an anonymous tip that Alex Shipley, a friend of his, had been offered a position to join Nixon's CRP as a key member. On hearing this news, Bernstein phoned Shipley, and Shipley duly confirmed that one Donald Segretti had approached him, but that he did not accept the offer. Bernstein tried to establish a connection between Segretti and Liddy, but he reached a dead end. He then called Myers, a Washington Post correspondent in the West Coast, to track down Segretti and collect information from him. Myers tracked down Segretti, but he was unable to get any meaningful information from him. Bernstein later discovered that Segretti, alongside Kalmbach, were part of an ongoing investigation at the Department of Justice. He also tried to create a link between Kalmbach and Segretti, but he failed again.
Alright, so after numerous chain links, Bernstein came to realize that some very high officials in the government, including the president himself, could be heavily involved in the Watergate scandal. Alright, so the investigation, showed up or, turned out some new information and new discovery every moment he is going deep into it, okay, and connecting the dots. All right, so this is really, really interesting, guys.
Bernstein discovered through another reporter that Kenneth Clausen, the deputy communications director at White House, was in possession of a letter that had to do with the Watergate conspiracy. When Clausen found out that Bernstein knew about this, and that he was going to publish it in the Post, he got scared and vowed to deny it should it go public. Having gathered enough points, the news outlet released to the public the involvement of the FBI in the scandal, how those involved worked for Nixon, how they paid for activities, etc. Washington Post published more facts on the charges initiated by the Democratic campaign. Bernstein was able to establish a connection between Segretti and Hunt, and Segretti and Dwight Chapin. Chapin was the White House scheduler and deputy assistant to President Nixon. Kalmbach financed Segretti, and this was found out by the FBI because of the telephone calls they both exchanged with Hunt. Time magazine published a story, citing Post's publications. They confirmed that Chapin had hired Segretti. Woodward, at this time, was interviewing Sloan again. Sloan confirmed that Kalmbach had control over the secret fund kept with Stans. The publication from both big news outlets rattled the CRP, and in retaliation, Robert Odle, Director of Administration and Personnel, CRP released 3 pages worth of attack against Post. McGregor, the new CRP director, also held a press conference where he refuted all the claims made by the Post while refusing to answer any questions from the journalists or the press. At this point, it was getting more apparent to both Woodward and Bernstein that the conspiracy was more significant than they had initially perceived. White House's refusal to cooperate with the Washington Post made it difficult for Woodward and Bernstein to prove their case. The 5th person that was suspected of having a hand in the secret fund was Haldeman, even though concrete evidence seemed elusive. Haldeman was the founder of CRP and the middleman between the president and the other members of the CRP involved in the Watergate scandal. As expected, the president denied any involvement, and this prompted Woodward to contact Deep Throat once again. Deep Throat could not come up with a piece of solid evidence, and he told Woodward that he had to get confirmation himself. Woodward contacted Sloan for confirmation. Sloan was not straightforward with any information but linked Woodward with an FBI agent who could help. The agent confirmed that Haldeman was involved, prompting Woodward and Bernstein to prepare a story linking Haldeman with the secret fund. Woodward and Bernstein had planned to reference Sloan as a source for their story. When the post about Haldeman was published, Sloan's attorney denied his testimony, and Ronald Ziegler, the press secretary to the government, denounced the post, making it difficult for Woodward and Bernstein to prove their story.
So the Watergate scandal was not enough to sway people's votes away from President Nixon, and he won with a landslide margin. Okay, so because they didn't cooperate, and that made it difficult for Woodward and Bernstein to prove their story.
Woodward and Bernstein were visibly frustrated. It seemed no one was willing to talk anymore, and their publications barely swayed the people who were still rooting for President Nixon for a second term. Bernstein went over to Los Angeles to meet with Myers and Segretti to try for more information. Segretti confirmed working for Chapin, while also mentioning that Kalmbach paid him. He also said that Chapin was receiving orders from Haldeman. Bernstein tried to convince Segretti to come out and put down his statement, but Segretti refused. By this time, President Nixon had already been re-elected as President of the United States of America. Bernstein contacted another source who also wished to remain anonymous. Still, there was no concrete evidence to nail anyone. Soon, the White House barred the Washington Post from all social functions in its environment, frustrating Woodward and Bernstein even more. The Los Angeles Times had at this period interviewed Alfred Baldwin, the security guard for CRP. This interview was recorded on tape. The trial of the Watergate scandal handled by Chief Judge Sirica was able to affirm the belief that the president was indeed involved in the Watergate scandal. Judge Sirica, the Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court of Columbia, ordered reporters to the court on 19 December 1972. He summoned the press to inform them of the illegality of attempting to extract information from a grand juror. In the aftermath of that, Chief Judge Sirica jailed Jack Nelson and Ronald Ostrow, 2 correspondents with Times, for refusing to release the tape, notes and documents of their interview with Baldwin to the court. The chief prosecutor, Earl Silbert, opined that Gordon Liddy was the leader of the whole operation and that he worked independently of CRP. Silbert told the court that he believed there is not enough evidence to charge anyone outside the 5 burglars, Hunt and Liddy. Silbert was of the opinion that the more people they charged, the tougher it gets to unravel the case. Hunt pleaded guilty after the opening statement. The Los Angeles Times and the NY Times both ran stories on the defendants. LA Times believed that each burglar would be paid $1,000 for every month spent in jail. In the next court session, Judge Sirica questioned 4 of the burglars and asked about the money paid to them. They all denied being paid to plead guilty. Bernard Barker, one of the burglars, remarked that he had no idea how the money got into his account. At the end of the trial, Judge Sirica was displeased by how Silbert went ahead with the prosecution. Woodward and Bernstein published a story on how the prosecution had gone wrong. Woodward went back and met with Deep Throat. Deep Throat confirmed that he was only going to verify information now and that he would not give any more information. Woodward then asked him about the connection between the special counsel to the president, Charles Colson, and John Mitchell, the campaign director to the Watergate scandal. Deep Throat confirmed that Colson was actively involved, while Mitchell was less actively involved. Woodward then met with Senator Ervin, the chairman, Senate Watergate Committee. Senator Ervin Senate was planning to call everyone to testify, even the president. CRP.
So after deep investigations, Times published that Nixon administration had, wiretaped new outlets, government officials, etc., to gather information surreptitiously, and how it had started as far back as 1969. Right? So, surreptitiously. I don't know how to pronounce it. So, surreptitiously, surreptitiously, and now it had started as far back as 1969. So CRP issued a subpoena through the court to summon Woodward. Let's see.
He issued a subpoena through the court to summon Woodward, Bernstein, and 3 other reporters to come and back up their claims with evidence. Did you know that on the 8th of January, 1973, the Watergate trial began and Judge Sirica remained the judge? President Nixon's desperate attempts to sabotage the investigation led people to believe he was hiding something. Woodward was approached one afternoon by Tim Butts, who claimed he had once worked in Army intelligence. Tim Butts claimed he had found a George Washington student who once spied for CRP. The student had a frat brother who was willing to tell it all, and Tim Butts introduced the source to Woodward as Craig Hillegas. Hillegas opened up on how they were contacted by CRP to spy and report, how they were paid using different methods, and how they were around 25 in number. Through the revelation by Hillegas, Woodward met with more CRP spies, and they confirmed the information. Woodward then met with Deep Throat, who told him that President Nixon was willing to spend to the tune of $5 million to bring down the post. Deep Throat also told Woodward that a confident Patrick Gray would be appointed the new acting director of the FBI. He believed that Gray's appointment would be political because Gray knew about the wiretapping of reporters. Upon being asked, Gray said he had turned over whatever documents he possessed on the Watergate scandal to John Dean.
Okay, so President Nixon, sensing that things were starting to go awry, held a news conference and announced that to the public he would use executive privilege to stop Dean from testifying at hearings. Okay, so, the story becomes more and more interesting.
Later in the day, however, Gray released a statement that said Dwight Chapin had indeed contacted Kalmbach and that he had truly hired Segretti. This was a big score for the Washington Post, as people started believing in the credibility of their publications. Sam Dash.
So on the 23rd of March 1974, Judge Sirica received a letter from one of the burglars, James McCord, that said that the burglars were being forced to plead guilty to avoid trial. Okay.
Chief counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee held a press conference telling the public that he had interviewed McCord and McCord would testify in congressional hearing. Woodward met with Deputy Press Secretary Gerald Warren to request a one-on-one meeting with the president. Woodward wanted to hear from the White House directly. As expected, the meeting was not accepted, and Woodward could not get the White House's version of the whole story. McCord testified to the Senate and indicted Liddy, Mitchell, and Colson. President Nixon held a press conference and promised to suspend anyone indicted in the Watergate scandal. Next to spill the beans was Stuart Magruder, the deputy campaign director CRP. He indicted Mitchell and Dean, telling the Senate about plans for the payoff, bugging, etc. The Washington Post published a story that Dean and Mitchell knew of the whole saga and that they helped plan the Watergate burglary. They went on to say that information came from Stuart Magruder, and that Mitchell and Dean had planned to buy silence from the defendants of Watergate. Dean issued a statement through his secretary, telling the press to be careful in making assumptions and drawing conclusions. Bernstein talked to some friends of Dean, and they believed that someone was trying to blame Dean. Dean claimed that he had rejected the wiretapping deal and had refused to be part of the conspiracy by rejecting the offer. Mitchell too claimed that he and Dean both rejected the wiretapping deal from CRP. President Nixon sent Dean to Camp David to put down his thoughts on the whole issue. By the time Dean came back, President Nixon had sided with Haldeman, and he had decided to pin the blame on Dean. New York Daily News published a story, stating that Gray had destroyed the documents with him. Gray had taken the files home, and he had burned them alongside his trash in his home. Dean then considered implicating the president, and was willing to testify that the president was an accomplice in the whole scandal. The Washington Post published a Sunday story that asserted that Haldeman and Ehrlichman, the assistant to the president on domestic affairs, were involved with the cover-up of the scandal. Haldeman and Ehrlichman both resigned the next day. They were joined by Richard Kleindienst, the Attorney General of the United States, and John Dean was fired too. Richardson Brooks was made the new Attorney General, and President Nixon addressed the public in the new developments.
So it was found out through the evidence found in, Ehrlichman's safe that 13 government officials and 4 officials had been wiretaped.
Dean was not allowed by the president to testify because he believed his words could implicate national security and covert operations. By the middle of October 1974, a lot of CRP members had resigned, and President Nixon had fired the special Watergate prosecutor. The newly appointed Attorney General had also resigned, alongside his deputy. Left with no choice, Nixon surrendered the remaining tapes to the court. Deep Throat immediately set up a meeting with Woodward, informing him that some parts of the tapes were missing. The tape had 18.5 minutes missing, and this made people believe that the president was actually hiding something.
Okay, so by late February 1974, almost everyone in the scandal pleaded guilty in court. The grand jury charged Chapin with perjury, while Mitchell and Stans were to be tried.
House Judiciary Committee began an impeachment process against President Nixon, who delivered to the State Union, "I want you to know that I have no intention whatever of walking away from the job that the American people elected me to do for the people of the United States." In his mind, he was going to outlast the scandal and continue being president, but the people who voted him in were quick to remind him that he wouldn't. The Watergate scandal saw the resignation of President Nixon as POTUS, sending a clear message to future presidents on the people's stance regarding scandals. Anyone who is capable of getting themselves made president should on no account be allowed to do the job. Douglas Adams. Conclusion. The possibility of President Nixon getting indicted in a felony would have been highly unlikely if Woodward and Bernstein had not been bold enough. It takes courage to establish a name as an investigative journalist. The Watergate scandal has opened the eyes of the people to the capability and weaknesses of presidents, and why they cannot be entirely trusted. It has also sent a clear message to aspiring presidents that the people will not sit idle and watch the rule of law get overruled by a leader. President Nixon might have won the election with a wide margin even if he didn't bug his opponents, but he was quite impatient and surrounded himself with bad advisors. Try this: always stand firm in truth and avoid being impatient with leadership. Avoid having impatient people as advisors because they will lead you astray due to clumsy planning.
Okay guys, that's it. That's the whole book. Alright, we finished it, and it was a really great message. Alright, we knew the biggest scandal in the history of the United States, okay, about President Nixon. A lot of people were involved actually, and but if it wasn't for Woodward and Bernstein, we wouldn't know the truth. Okay, so shout out to them actually, because they are good investigative journalists. And this is the message, guys. Always stand firm in truth and avoid being impatient with leadership. Avoid having impatient people as advisors because they will lead you astray due to clumsy planning. Okay, so I really enjoyed this story and enjoyed this book. I heard it for listened to the book for 3 times now, and that's really, really good. Okay, so I hope it was a good book for you and it was a good story for you. and you got something out of it. Thank you guys. Have a great day. Love you all. Bye bye.